welcome to the video on the topic of liquidity in a corporate issuer's context or corporate finance context. So for a company, liquidity can mean one of two things. When discussing the individual positions in a company's balance sheet or the individual assets stroke liabilities that appear on the balance sheet, liquidity will pertain to how near that position is to either generating cash inflow or cash outflow. So your book defines this as the nearness. I'm not sure if this is a proper noun. I think proximity would be better. Okay, the nearness to cash when it comes to assets, which are supposed to generate, benefits or cash inflows, and when it comes to liabilities, the need to settle that liability, so a cash outflow. When, however, thinking about the company as a whole, not just individual lines of the balance sheet, but for the company as a whole, liquidity is all about the ability to meet that company's short-term liabilities. And please appreciate the fact that, when it comes to this, your book does go into it, right? If you line up a company's current assets, then the most liquid of them all is, so this is most liquid, of course, cash itself. Some people say that prepaid expenses are even more liquid because you've already spent the cash. Okay, but putting that aside, cash is the most liquid one. Then you're going to have some, short-term investments, typically into things which your curriculum describes as marketable securities. You will have accounts receivable, AR, whereas you're waiting for the client to pay you. Of course, short-term investments are typically readily tradable in the market, so you can easily turn them into a source of liquidity. AR, you're waiting for the client to pay, and inventory is the one is the current asset that's sort of furthest away from a cash inflow, because inventory first needs to be sold. The amount from the sale becomes an accounts receivable figure, and you still need to wait for the money for the client to pay you. Now, in terms of short-term liabilities, the most liquid is going to be accounts payable. Your book says, even before that, wages payable, or let's say accrued payroll. That's what the curriculum refers this. How the curriculum refers to this. So money that you need to pay your employees for the work performed, that comes first. Then various types of accounts payable. So AP, basically. A/P, accounts payable, and then, somewhere we have short-term debt along the line, so that the portion of debt which has to be paid within the next sort of year, that I think is going to be the least liquid of the liabilities. Anyway, don't worry about this. What you need to be able to name or differentiate between are the so-called primary and secondary sources of liquidity. So primary liquidity sources that the company will typically use first before it turns to those more exotic, less likely to be used sources of liquidity. So now, on a day-to-day basis, your source of liquidity is going to be your operations, and we'll talk about this. But first of all, you're going to have some cash on the balance sheet, right, and on the bank account, typically in the bank account, and that's your primary liquidity source. And of course, those marketable securities, those short-term investments, which can be turned into cash without too much risk of not knowing what the value is going to be. Then, a company typically can borrow some money, right? So borrowings, short-term borrowings, typically you do that from a bank. If you're a bigger company, then you probably can easily issue commercial paper. So from banks, bondholders, or holders of debt, but also trade credit from suppliers. We don't have to pay immediately for our for the stuff that we're buying from suppliers. We can negotiate trade credit, and we typically are successful in doing this. And then your book says, well, just generally cash flow from the business, from its operations. So cash from operations, and it's at this point that we remember we are in the corporate issuers section of the curriculum, and they sort of start explaining here how the cash flow statement works and how you can get an idea of what operating cash flows are from the cash flow statement, and how you can even, if you take cash flow from operations and you add back if you adjust it downwards for capex, you can arrive at something called free cash flow. Now, these are things that we have also discussed obviously in the financial statements analysis section of our videos. So I'm not going to tell you here how the cash flow statement works, or indeed how to compute free cash flow. We've got a separate video on that, on cash flow analysis and cash flow ratios and common size analysis of the cash flow statement. Anyway, now, aside from those primary liquidity sources, we also have the so-called secondary, or what your book considers to be secondary liquidity sources. So these are avenues for getting liquidity, but you turn to these when the other ones are exhausted, let's say. So, for example, suspending or reducing the amounts of dividends that you pay to your equity holders, right? That's a bit of that's a bit drastic, right? Or delaying, or indeed also reducing here your capital expenditure, which obviously in the short run allows you to save cash, but in the longer run may lead to asset obsolescence, the company not being able to perform work at full capacity, missed opportunities, etc. Now, another one is issuing equity, and this is not necessarily the most obvious choice for businesses, because, why is this not a primary source, whereas borrowings are? Because from the point of view of shareholders, issuing equity causes dilution for the existing shareholders. So they prefer not to do that. They prefer for the company to borrow additional money rather than issue additional shares, so as not to sort of relinquish their proportionate share of the business and their power of the business over the business. A pretty sort of, I guess, obvious one is also trying to renegotiate various contracts. So renegotiating contract terms, the terms of various contracts, things like rents, maybe being able to postpone rent payments, leases on assets, on equipment, maybe contracts with suppliers where you can spread things out a bit, or maybe you can take the amounts of debt which are owing in the short term and convert them into something more long term. Those are all ideas. Selling assets. Now, once again, this is risky in the sense of what if you start selling stuff that you really need in the business, then that reduces your capacity, and ultimately a source of liquidity. I don't know if it's a source, but it's a way to stop liquidity from draining out, is filing for bankruptcy. Obviously, a very sort of last resort measure. I guess, when other possibilities have failed. Okay, something that is quite important as well in terms of its propensity, its possibility to be tested, are so-called drags and pulls on liquidity. And you need to know what they are on liquidity, because they make potentially for very testable material in a sort of ABC style format, right? So these are pressures on liquidity. Both phenomena or both concepts will have a negative effect on a company's liquidity position. So what are the drags on liquidity? These are lags in cash inflows. So delays in cash, in the way cash is flowing in. Now, why do we have these drags, or what is their source? Well, primarily, I mean, how do you get your cash? You typically get your cash from customers who owe you money as a result of, buying stuff, getting invoices, and you may have uncollected receivables where clients are simply falling due. They're becoming delinquent. They're being late in their payments. And of course, one way to try and solve this problem is to be more strict in terms of your credit policies, trade credit policies, to whom you give this option to the possibility to delay payment. And once you have done it, be more strict about collecting those payments. However, if you try to be too strict, that may cause your customers to look elsewhere, where a business is more lenient. It all depends on the relative power of the buyers versus you, the supplier. Another drag on liquidity could be, a source of it could be so-called obsolete inventory. The fact that you've got inventory items which are simply not selling because they've become obsolete, because they've been lying around for too long to any longer be attractive. And also borrowing constraints. This is all about, short-term borrowing, for example, becoming in the market scarce, unavailable due to changed market conditions, or perhaps simply becoming quite expensive as a result of interest rates going up. So some ideas here. Now, pulls on liquidity will affect sort of the other side of the cash flow equation, cash outflows. And these are factors which cause an acceleration, a speeding up of cash outflows. So the company either being forced to, or voluntarily paying money quicker than it should. Now, one reason for this is quite obvious: making payments early. Early in the sense of earlier than needed, than required by the amount of, before the due date on the invoice. I mean, why would you do it? We kind of said, maybe in a previous video, maybe it's because you're getting some kind of benefit, some kind of reward, like a discount. Okay, and then it's absolutely fine. You should do that. You should use it if it makes sense. But if you're paying before the due date, but without any financial reward, then that's just plain bad. That's bad cash management, liquidity management. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't pay early unless you are being rewarded for it. Now, another reason would be reduced credit limits. So this is the notion of, for example, the bank cutting your, or not even the bank, sorry, with credit limits. It's your supplier cutting the amount of, reducing the amount of trade credit they give you, and as a result, you kind of pretty quickly need to pay what's due, but you're not getting a fresh sort of portion of payment deferral, and that is an immediate pull on your liquidity. In a similar way, you could experience this with a bank, which may introduce lower limits on your short-term credit lines or lines of credit. This would be, versus vis-a-vis the bank. This is from suppliers. These credit limits, whereas here from banks. And once again, when a bank reduces the amount, the line of credit amount, you need to pay up, and you don't get any fresh bunch of borrowing. And finally, your book says something kind of very vague, general, low liquidity positions. This is basically when a company is experiencing some chronic liquidity shortage. I mean, I'm not sure if that really qualifies, but let's put it down. Your book mentions it under pause on liquidity. Fine, chronic. This is a chronic, so persistent liquidity shortage or shortages. Okay, and the final bit of this section is all about how we measure and evaluate liquidity. So measuring and evaluating liquidity, and here there's a lot of overlap with financial statements analysis, where ratios are also discussed. And I've already shot a video where, as part of our discussion of the balance sheet and analyzing the balance sheet, we introduced and sort of talked about various ratios, liquidity ratios. So this happens here as well. So just as a reminder, we've got a very broad ratio known as the current ratio, and this is the relationship between current assets and current liabilities. So just taking those two big aggregate items from the two sides of the balance sheet into the numerator and denominator respectively. And then you've got sort of more narrower ratios, namely the quick ratio, which is also known as the acid test ratio, where you just change the numerator from the previous version, and in this one, instead of taking current assets as such, you limit things to cash and short-term marketable securities, so short-term sort of investments, which can easily be sold in the market for a known value, and receivables from your sort of clients, so trade receivables, and you divide this by current liabilities. Now, the idea of this ratio is that it omits inventory versus the previous version where we had current assets as such. Obviously, inventory being the least liquid of current assets, and your book kind of says, well, if this ratio is more than one being sort of parity here between the numerator and denominator. If this ratio is more than one, then that's a signal that the company could settle all of its current liabilities right here, right now, using the cash that it's got, the short-term marketable securities that it's got, and the receivables that will flow in without having to sell or liquidate any of its inventory, right? Okay. Now, an even more extreme version is the so-called cash ratio. Now, I've been teaching this stuff, and previously I had to learn about it, but when I work with people who actually, for example, work in banks and look at this stuff, these ratios are very rarely used in practice because they're just too simplistic. People typically in banking these days use more, or tend to use things like coverage ratios, which are a little bit more sophisticated. I've never really come across serious analysts who use this stuff, other than, perhaps some system computes this stuff, but nobody really, I think, uses it seriously in credit analysis now, or liquidity analysis. So in the cash ratio, we just limit ourselves to cash and short-term marketable securities. We don't even touch receivables or take them into account, and we divide this by current liabilities and see what we get. And once again, the idea is, if this cash ratio were to be more than 1, it would mean that a company can settle its current liabilities right now using the cash and short-term marketable securities that it's got, and you wouldn't even have to sell your inventory or collect any receivables to settle all your liabilities. So that would point to a very sort of comfortable situation in terms of a company's liquidity.